Dear fellow architects, interior designers, and friends, I am architect Manoj Chobe, Chairperson Triple ID Bhopal Center. And I welcome you all on the second edition of the Master Forum being organized by Institute of Indian Interior Designers. The Master Forum is an event where an eminent personality who has shaped and influenced our built environment shares their ideologies and thoughts through their projects. Today, we are in conversation with architect Revati Kamath, who will enlighten us with various subjects close to her heart and imbued in her long and illustrious practice. The session is being moderated by interior designer Ravisha Merchant.
She has contributed to the exhibition Traditional Architecture in India for the Festival of India in Paris in 1986. She is also on the contribution. She was also on the contributing design team for the Eternal Gandhi Multimedia Museum and a co-curator and designer for the exhibition Craft, a tool for social change for VHAI. Some of her projects include a desert resort in Rajasthan, House for Nalin Tomar, Horse Khas Village, Delhi, Jivashram Animal Shelter, Delhi, Akshay Pratishthan, Delhi, Community Center in Maheshwar, and a lot of work for weavers in Maheshwar. She's also done a school for weavers' children at Maheshwar. Kamath House, we will be discussing on her own house where she's sitting right now. The gateway for Jindal power plant of at Chhattisgarh, and of course our very own Museum of Tribal Heritage, Bhopal. So over to you, ma'am. Your work is based on the premise that the goal of human culture is to respect life forms and the environment, and to value its regenerative and self-healing capacities. Your projects are indigenous, they are sensitive, and they are eco-sensitive, I would say. One finds this great balance in your work which bridges both the contemporary and the traditional. So how do you take on the task of preserving centuries of local traditions while still producing iconic modern structures?
Well, we've been practicing for over 40 years and have done more than 300 projects so far. Our work divided into three broad categories. One is doing more with less. Two is eco-sensitive or the eco-sensitive architecture. And three is diverting the mainstream. So all our 200 projects fall into one or two of the, into either of these categories, or sometimes into all the categories. Now, the first, which is doing more with less, really involves or is inspired by the words of Mahatma Gandhi. And Mahatma Gandhi had said that think of the poorest man you know and see if whatever you do is of any use to him. And then do it if it is. But when I contemplated, I found that the man was not, no man was the weakest link in the building industry chain. The weakest link in the building industry chain was that of the woman who carries headloads in buildings. So the main inspiration for me was to actually see that her life, or the quality of her life, is made much better. How could whatever work I do enhance the quality of her life and increase her self-worth? Which is what led me to mud architecture. Because the woman, the laborer woman, possesses the skills to work with mud today, here and now. And I thought that in most of my projects, I should incorporate this capacity and capability and popularize it so that more and more spaces are built with mud, or at least plastered with mud. So there's a lot of my work which is inspired uh, by focusing on these women and involving them in the actual act of building creatively. So that is one. The second is, of course, the use of craft. There is an incredible depth of craft in our society. Contemporary architecture discards these crafts. So the use of craft is also one of the major aspects of that characterize our work. So craft and so all our buildings use labor-intensive processes, and I think today we've realized, the world has realized. 40 years ago, this was really going against the stream. 40 years ago, they said, "Oh, we don't need labor-intensive structures." But the fact is that we need structure, systems which reduce the amount of labor involved, and the industrial process did not see this as a merit. But we have always maintained that the extensive use of labor and the crafting of buildings, celebrating joyously the skills of the craftspeople and incorporating them into our buildings has been one of our major goals. The other aspect is, of course, the use of locally available materials. The idea of 0-kilometer resource base, or maybe 5, maybe 20, but not 200, not 2000. So locally available materials are very, very crucial to our design. Of course, in many cases, the use of industrial products like steel has been used by us. In the cathedral at Nagaland and Imphal, we had these huge spans, people, 2,000 people sitting in a hall, and in the auditorium at Raigad, we have used steel. We have used steel as a structural material. I don't mind using steel. I prefer it to using concrete, because steel is recyclable. And I think that if we use it in a way that the material can be salvaged and reused, it's a much better material than RCC, which needs to be broken and demolished and produces waste. And then we have a whole new cycle of recycling that waste. So initially, when we started our practice, we did a lot of buildings which belong to the category of doing more with less. And as time went by, we started to build our house.
Right.
We built our house. We found our land in Anandpur village, which is about 3 kilometers from the Delhi border. Surajkund, which was once one of the earliest cities of Delhi. So this village is adjoining Surajkund. And it's a rocky terrain and this was the area where Badarpur and schist were mined for the city of Delhi. Badarpur is stone dust.
Right.
The whole city of Delhi was built with it. So our house was built in Anandpur village, which is about, like I said, 4 kilometers from the Delhi border. And it is made of stone and mud, both which are available in plenty on our site. of course, the land was completely ravaged when we moved in, and all the trees were chopped off, and there were two holes in the ground, deep holes. Now we use those as ponds, and we use that also as the material where we could source our mud from. And so we collected all the stones that were available on the site that the miners had broken and left, because it was an abandoned quarry. And then we also collected the mud from these ponds and shaped them into mud bricks. Yeah. Next.
So you have this very innate sense of getting the outside in. You know, you have this beautiful. Your sites are like a poetry. They get the outside in, and it's really nice the way you follow the rhythm.
Yes, it's very, very important to me because you see the building, the materials that are used in the act of building must create a dialogue with the outside, because it is outside that is providing the material to the inside, and it is also giving it a content, and it is the spaces of the inside have to incorporate the spaces of the outside into it in a continuum, because I think a sense of infinity is very much part of the act of making architectural spaces. So the aspect of introducing infinity into a space is critical, which is why the outside becomes a part of the composition of inside. Now, when I say composition, it's really abstract. Now, we must realize that the act of creating architecture is not just abstract. It is not a mental process. It involves your whole being, the whole creative being. So you have to be in a state, a meditative state of knowing your environment. And that is really what an ecological architect is all about, you know. An eco-literate architect is one who carries the consciousness of the environment and the ecology of a space, the ecology of the people who belong to that space, which means that both nature and culture create the ecology of a place. So to perceive that and to keep it in your, and to be in a meditative state and to create. Now this is a rocky outcrop. We have a green roof. So we've used mud brick for all the walls, and for the roof we used ballis from a nearby farm. Ballis meaning eucalyptus ballis, and then we used bamboo. And we have a thin layer of, and we have a layer of bamboocrete, which is about 1.5 inches of concrete over the bamboo. Okay, and then on that we have a waterproofing, which is, we have pasted rubber sheets, and then we have put soil over it, and we grow, and the grass grows on the roof. This creates an incredible amount of insulation. And we don't use air conditioners. So the use of mud, stone, and an earth, bamboocrete and earth roof. Now you see, the most important aspect is really to be part of the environment in which the act of building enhances the quality of the environment and sustains all forms of life. So our building here, and you know, in the disposal of our waste, we create a pond. The waste is treated naturally, through a process which is called the Balram, not Balram, it's called a Shankar Balram digester. Now this Shankar Balram digester involves the anaerobic process, and it has two. It's a technology which was promoted by the National Buildings Organization many years ago, and subsequently, of course, it has been abandoned because other people who are into sanitation have kind of tried to squash that, the popularity of the Shankar Balram. However, I find that the Shankar Balram waste disposal is excellent and works very well in a situation where we have an acre of land around us, so that we can digest the waste over 20 days and let it discharge into the soil or into form a water body. Now, and we have fish in that water body. We have green. We have not algae, but we have plants, water plants growing in that, and the water is finally going down in and recharging the groundwater. So that is one. The mud walls can become part of the soil again. It can grow vegetables. It can grow trees. It can grow. So as soon as whenever the house really ceases to exist, the mud can go back to the soil and become one with it. And the grass on the roof is something that produces oxygen. So all in all, our building is zero carbon rating, because all the wood that we have used here is also recycled, or we have used bamboo, and we have planted bamboo in our land. So all the bamboo is already replaced, and we've got enough bamboo to build a new house with. Now in the last 20 years or so, we could have built 2 houses with the bamboo that we have produced. So can we go on?
Yes, sure. You've spoken a lot about bamboo-crete as a roofing material.
Yeah, these are my solar cookers. Have a look at it. These are solar cookers made with very thin bamboo and mud and broken mirrors. The parabolic shape focuses the sun's rays onto a tray and cooks them. I mean, this is so simple. It costs nothing. And I really think that, and I took about 3, this is the other solar cooker, which is really fixed in place and is part of the architecture of the house. Now what you see next to it is a shaft. Now this air shaft really allows the house to be ventilated at all times. So the hot air rises, goes through the shaft and goes up. And at night, the cold air comes through the shaft and into the room. So in winter, of course, we block it with newspaper, with a roll of newspaper. But it functions wonderfully during the summers as a cooler. And sometimes we also allow sprinklers to keep the bio wall wet, so that there is coolth around the shaft, and the air that comes in is cooled by the spray of water. We use atomizers, and The atomizers create a very fine spray, and there are many in the courtyard. So the whole house is really 10 to 12 degrees lower than the outside, which precludes the use of air conditioners. So we have a solar cooker and we don't use air conditioners. And the mud as a material is a great insulator. So it enhances the quality of our life. It cleans the air that comes in because it has these very fine pores, and the air that comes through it into the house allows the whole building to breathe. And living here is extremely comfortable. Now, this is a drawing which lists all the forms of life that are around our building, our house, and how our house utilizes the sun, the wind, the water, the land, and it sustains all the creatures, both on the land and in the space. So I've listed about 100 species or so here. So we have snakes, we learn how to live with them, and then mongoose and nilgai and civet cats and monkeys, and we have birds, at least 50 or 60 species of birds, and then we have porcupines, not hedgehogs, porcupines. Of course, we have the moor. I mean, I see one dancing every morning. And so the quality of life that is produced by living with nature is very, very critical. And I think that this relationship and this symbiosis is especially important in the city. And housing people by providing each family with a reasonable amount of space, not 12 square meters as the government is doing right now, or maybe even less than that. At least 35 to 40 square meters per family should be earmarked and in the city for the poor, so that the ecosystems can be designed within the city to be part of nature. So the city open spaces can become part of the treatment of waste. If we use anaerobic systems to digest our waste through the use of the Shankar Balram at a small scale and at a large scale, we can produce methane and other gases which can light the street lights. We can create ponds which become recreational, which also become areas where the clean waste or semi-clean waste is treated before it goes into and ground. And there are which can become part of the community spaces adjacent to this, besides the parks that use of these ridiculous ornamental parks, which are fenced in. The whole idea of open space and the city and the forest, the city and agriculture have to live in a continuum and have to be in a continuum. History and tradition and the skills of the people have to become part of this continuum. And only when we live in a space like this will there be a great amount of satisfaction, rather than seeing architecture as an expression of your wealth or expressing technology only. Some buildings to express technology, but not all of humanity has to express technology. And I also question the use of such incredible amounts of cement in our construction. We must think twice. The use of bamboo and mud is very, very important, because it really involves the least amount of embodied energy. Hanuma retreat, it was a project where I explored my landscaping abilities, and it was in collaboration with Sonia Rashid, who owned this resort, and he worked with me very closely. We designed an edible garden in the whole place, where we planted 80% of the species that we planted were edible or related to an edible species. And collected all the rainwater, drained them into swales rather than have a network of sewers or sewers. So they became part of a drainage system, which led to the deepest pond on the site. And then each house, each cluster had a garden around it and a courtyard inside it. And we used species like marigold, kevada, lemongrass, citronella, and other species that repelled mosquitoes, because that was very, very important. Then we've used a bud tree, at the amphitheater. Then we've used forest trees, species, and bamboo to surround the whole resort. And we've grown herbs. There's a herb garden, and there's a vegetable garden growing wonderful growing herbs and other vegetables like artichoke and many others that Sonia could add to. I don't know what they're growing there now, but it could add to the to whatever is served. Now, yeah, these are passages, and all the species of plants that you see: Clocacia, that is Arbi, Alocasia, lemongrass. So the fragrances of the plants are very much part of the design. Anar, orange in the courtyard. Bananas, those are the great, very fast growing species, and I love the look of it. And it provides...
Sonia says that she grows leek, chard, broccoli, and many more.
Many more, no? So that's wonderful. So instead of having ornamental flowers, we've got all these growing, and these are as beautiful. So that's it, So it becomes very crucial. So we must expand the species, plant species, to include edible.
We have a couple of questions here if you would like to take them.
Yes.
One is that, can you explain how the Shankar Balram digester works?
Yes, the Shankar Balram digester is very simple. It consists of two long pipes, about 2 meters long, going into the ground. And the water from the pot and the wastewater goes into one of these shafts. The two shafts are filled with water, and all the waste goes into this aqueous, into this watery chamber. Okay. Now the process of digestion begins in the stomach itself with anaerobic bacteria. So the anaerobic bacteria are within the Shankar Balram system, and after a process of 21 days or so, the water then discharges into a space around it on which we grow banana trees, and we grow other plants with roots that break down whatever waste remains in the water. So, and then the water from this is our addition, our Kamat Design Studios addition to the Shankar Balram. And after the this chamber of plants, or a reed bed around the plants, there is an outlet, and the water goes out and can go into a swale and then go back into the ground through a recharge pit. So that is what a Shankar Balram is. So you don't need the system, the natural system of digestion within the body itself produces enough bacteria in an environment which is surrounded by water. So that is what we use, and that is what a Shankar Balram is.
Right.
So the digestion is all, there's hardly any BDO produced, which means the amount of waste is minimal in the system, and the use of plants with it kind of make it zero, and the water is completely treated, and is so even in urban systems this particular combination can be used at different scales, you know, the scale of a house, the scale of a neighborhood, the scale of a cluster, or the scale of a colony. So the same digestive system, natural digestive systems, can be used at different scales.
Right. We have a lot of questions, but we'll take them maybe after your presentation.
Yeah, okay. Then let's go now to, this is the swimming pool at
Januma Retreat.
Januma Retreat,
Yeah.
where I've planted all the plants that can tolerate chlorine along the edges of the pool. Oh, I love the use of this grass. The color of the grass is similar to the color of the stone. And so you're asking about how the outside and the inside relate to each other. It's these subtle aspects where and this is the restaurant.
This looks beautiful in the night.
Yes, you see, we created scales at the Januma Retreat. There is a scale where, you know, the feel of the whole property is very different when you're on a bicycle, or you're on a horse, or you're walking, you know, or you're jogging, or the scale is very different when you're playing golf in that little golf course, putting hole or putting green. And the scale is very different when you're inside the room or when you're walking down the corridor. So the use of open spaces and the integration of the open space into and the plant life into the sense of the resort has to be articulated and enjoyed. And like I said, smell, fragrances also form a major part of the way in which space is enhanced.
I think we sometimes ignore this as designers. We don't give it relevant importance, fragrance. And I think that matters a lot, be it any project. If the moment you go in, your senses, go to a different level when the fragrance is right. And when it's, yeah.
When you walk down the corridor, the fragrance of the lemongrass and the kevda are so exhilarating. And then as you walk through the passage, you get ginger lilies and you get mogra, and then you come into the courtyard and you have orange, to the orange blossoms. All of these add to the quality of the air. Then we have these incredibly sweet bridges that go across the swales. So they added certain dimension. The swales kind of bisect the property into spaces which are adjacent to the cottages, and then the other public spaces. They are all divided with natural elements.
So this is the beauty of all your projects. You see, even tribal museum, it's like, integrating what is around and bringing the outside in, and there's this feel goodness, and there's this poetic rhythm, there's a flow, it's nothing harsh, or it's nothing that, disturbs your movement.
Yes, flow is very, very important to me while I create architecture. Continuity, or celebrating the continuum, whether it is the built fabric, whether it is tradition, whether it is the outside and the inside, or whether it is the landscape, whether it is the geology of the place, or the architectural traditions of a place, or the people of the place. All of these become part of the ensemble of architecture.
You've been doing this, for years. You've been talking about sustainability for years. You've been,
Yeah, for 45 years I've been talking sustainability.
And you find people talking about it now, and like stressing on it now during this pandemic. They're suddenly talking about people-centric architecture. They're suddenly talking about things that you've always been emphasizing on.
Doing.
Yes.
Don't forget that for the last 40 years we've been doing it, showing through examples as to how you have to tackle these projects. So I'm glad people are talking about it. The time is right. I knew that the time would be right and that the whole world would move in this direction, which is also what I've been saying for a very long time.
So you've been also very assertive with the leads, regarding the standard rating of buildings. You also said that these materials have always been there and you've always used them. And what are your thoughts on that?
Oh God, I've always been using these materials, and these are far, far superior to some, to minimize the technological, let us say, guzzling of energy, which is what the LEED rating is. It's all about air conditioning and how to use better air conditioners that are a little more ecological than the air conditioner of the earlier generation. So I don't buy all technologically, let's say technologically biased projects or values. To me, you get a much better rating. I challenge the Griha Council to give my buildings a platinum rating. That's also necessary. I'm not saying it's not necessary, but your values have to go beyond that. and beyond that. Now, why should I use some other material? Why should I use burnt brick when mud brick will do? When mud brick will do its job, why should I use burnt brick? Anyway, let's go. Oh, the museum is here. That's very good.
And
So here too, we have only the building really sits quite inconspicuously in the space.
yes,
But at the same time, when you go to the other side, the courtyard, then you see the whole museum is really like a series of huts sitting in the landscape, the rocky landscape. And the whole building is on stilts, something that Corbusier had advocated. And I think it's critical here in this building. Although, and I enjoy this deep veranda, which is part of this social space
correct.
where the artisans are living and working. So they used to live here when they were building the museum and work here. So these verandas are supposed at the lower level where the landscape just flows is part of the part of incorporating the craft activity into the museum, where the craft activity is can be observed from the upstairs, and yet if you want to be involved with the craftspeople, you come downstairs and you work with them and you sit with them and you enjoy or delve deeper into the act of creating objects that belong to the tribal heritage. Now, there are 42 tribes in Madhya Pradesh, and they all needed to be represented here. I needed to make a space in which the aesthetic or way of life of the tribal could be represented by themselves, where the tribals themselves could represent their life and their spaces within the space that I had created, within the fabric or the rhythms of so-called aesthetic of that whole area. So the play of light, the play of space, the flow of movement, the flow of and the quality of light, craft, the spacing of the columns, the design of the trusses, the design of the beams, the flow of air within the spaces, the courtyards breathing, allowing the whole space to breathe. Of course, I wanted atomizers in the courtyard. The government is yet to do that. The clients are yet to understand that and do it. If the atomizers are there, then even in the summer, the whole museum will function at a much better quality, level. The quality of air and the coolth of the air would be much more. So these beams, these trusses, these laced trusses are all inspired by tribal rhythms. And these rhythms these designs allow the tribals to create an infill within this geometry, because it is a geometry that has been informed by the objects and the dance forms and the music of the 42 tribes. The tree and the forest become a major element in the composition. So all the columns of the museum are seen as potential trees. So each of these tribes, each truss becomes a canvas for expression of tribal rhythms and of objects. Now look at this. These are the artists from Sarguja.
This place is absolutely world class, and I think whoever visits Bhopal, it has to visit this space. It's like physically being and seeing the exhibit, creates memories, and it's embedded in there when you're there.
That's right. So the museum, the idea of the modern or contemporary museum, which sees the object as separate from the architecture, where the object is placed in the architecture
Correct.
as an isolated um, event, is something that I do not understand and do not contribute to. To me, the whole environment and the landscape and the outside and the inside and the tribal, the 2000 tribe, I think about 2000 people have worked on this museum.
I
Now,
love the way you say that, it is not for them, it's not for the tribes, it
so
is,
it's not
with them that you created this. So,
right, and they can create now with the building. Now the building becomes a space in which the tribals can express themselves. There's a lot of space because it involves, it envelopes their work, becomes part of their consciousness when the work is being, and it makes them not so self-conscious. So they can express themselves without being very self-conscious. Now in a very modern building, the aesthetic of the tribal, or the, I don't know, wouldn't call it aesthetic, but the way of life or the way of expressing of the tribal and the building, in this particular case, are in a continuum. They are not separate. The building is informed by the tribal way of life and understanding and consciousness, and that in turn energizes the tribal consciousness to blossom. And so the viewer, as well as the
beauty.
person who is creating, or the tribal who is creating, are part of that process. And that sense of, the continuum and always establishing links and bonds and celebrating the whole creative process and common consciousness that pervades this whole space. The consciousness of the tribal, the consciousness of the architect, the consciousness of even the bureaucrat who has participated in the decision making, the engineers who have contributed to the building, the artists who have worked with the tribals, are all part of this process. And the building really is a space where this process can continue to live. I only wish that when the changes are being made to the architecture, they refer back to the architect to be able to integrate them more seamlessly into the architectural fabric.
At this point, I would like to ask that how do you manage, how do you convince your clients to understand your design philosophy, to work with you again from the client side?
Work with my clients.
Yes.
I don't keep them as separate, even if it is, I try and always work with people rather than for them. So the collaborative participatory process is part of my design philosophy. So the client client doesn't feel alienated unless they have a problem, unless they have an attitudinal problem. And invariably, even if they do over the short period of time, over the long run, after about 4 years, I always get a call from the client saying, "Thank you very much for the building that you've made for me." So it may take them a few years to realize the selflessness with which one really works in order to produce a building that is best fit for the people who use it and for the people who make within it, as in the case of the museum. It has to be a space where the people who are creating the exhibits feel part of that space and feel that space respects them.
You've done a design for this NGO Muskan in Bhopal again. Unfortunately, I don't have the pictures to share. But I've seen you grown. I think gone over 2 floors and
2 floors with mud. Yes.
Yes. So, would you like to explain how you manage the foundation and the roofing and how this mud structure is going to sustain?
In that particular case, I think we used pile foundations because soil was unbearable. I mean, it couldn't take load. So the contractor told me, and I had actually designed other kinds of foundations in which I had arches. I had arched foundations. But the fellow said that in this day and age that he was that the contractor said that he couldn't handle it. So I said that we can put pile foundations and put a beam, and then we built this 2-storied mud structure. They made all the mud bricks on the site itself with mud from a nearby field. We tried a lot of different muds, tried to stabilize it with lime.
So are you part of the design process? Do you have skilled labor for this, or do you have to train the labor on site?
No. Just labor from the site, from anywhere, with minor inputs through the contractor, can produce an architecture. The society is ready to work. So I don't become like a lorry baker where I have my team or a guild of craftsmen that I peddle around, No. The people who belong to that space always have a tradition of earth architecture. We have to just evoke that memory in them and they can produce the work.
So we have more questions. Maybe I can take a couple of them.
Yes, please do that.
Yeah. So one question is, what according to your opinion is future responsive architecture? What according to your opinion is future responsive architecture?
Well, you have to have a vision for the future. Now, whether you see the vision for the future as ecological or whether you see it as technological would be different and would create different responses. Or maybe not. Maybe it can create one, a series of responses. So you can have, for instance, the human being is a species, and is a form of life that really needs to live in an environment and in a space and has to be able to breathe fresh air, produce waste, use water, put back clean water, and the human being has to evolve patterns of living through which nature is enhanced. You are part of nature. You have no way to kind of wish that you are not a human being, or that you are not an animal, or that you are not part of nature. The human being is part of nature. And when you are part of nature, your civilization has to express that. If you want to reach the stars and you want to reach the sky and the moon, that's another aspect of the human endeavor and aspiration that has to be respected. But if these two are seen as divergent, then there is a problem. We have to converge these two diametrically opposite perspectives, where technology doesn't have to destroy the relationship of the human being to the ecosystem, as it has done in industrial civilization. So we are at a stage where we have to welcome the new civilization. And I'm glad everybody is doing that these days. Yes.
Revati, Revati,
Yeah,
yours has
Manoj,
been a
please
very
go ahead.
distinguished career with many awards and accolades. But as per you, what has been the most rewarding moment in your architectural career?
Well, when people say that they are moved by my building and they call me up and tell me that Raj Reval went to the museum and he said, I cried because of the beauty. And that to me is really better than any silly award that some stupid group wants to bestow on you. Just that direct human response is so rewarding. When my client rings up and says that I love living here, thank you. That is really something that I relish and cherish.
That's very much true. From a common people to the head of state, anybody who comes to Bhopal, Tribal Heritage Museum is on their to-do list. So that's a great building which a great gift which you have given to Bhopal and Madhya Pradesh. We thank you very much for it.
Thank you very much. But I hope that the bureaucrats understand the need to preserve that quality and not destroy it.
There's another question. In this time of pandemic, how mud architecture can help city life? Is there anything that could be done to already existing structures, and can they be made naturally cool or well ventilated?
You suddenly can't you can't just plaster the mud onto the building and expect it to work. You can do simple small things, like you're on the roof of your terrace. You can put mud pots, and you can ensure the ghadas. I've used ghadas to insulate roofs in many places. So since 80% of the heat of a building is absorbed through the roof, insulating the roof can be a major activity that people can do. The other aspect is that the internal walls of any building can all be in mud. Mud stores cool. Mud is a great insulator. It insulates sound. It holds toxins in the air within its air pockets and filters the air and lets it in. So the use of mud is very much part of the urban space, and especially for rebuilding slums. It is a material which can be used to rebuild slums. It can be used as internal walls in multi-storied buildings. I have built recently a 5-storied building with stabilized earth blocks. The stabilizing with lime and a slight amount of, I've used lime stabilized blocks. I have used cement stabilized blocks. So I have a steel structure, and I have used cement stabilized blocks because the soil there was sandy of the local soil. So I've used cement stabilized blocks, and we have these incredible, it's a 5-story building with these material. So it has very much it can be, it has a great potential and can be used as part of the urban process. There is a, it's just that you have to find the ways to do it. And it can be a very interesting way because the people themselves can participate in making their own buildings because they have the skills. Now the issue is that the rich have also to use the same material. Otherwise it is not aspirational. So mud has to become an aspirational material for the city dweller, both rich and poor.
Someone asked how travel has influenced you and how other architects' work abroad have influenced you, and whether the exposure has, inspired your work.
Definitely. The Adobe architecture all over the world is, man, earth architecture is there all over the world. You go to Germany, you go to Switzerland, you go to England, and you go to the Americas, you go to Africa, you go to Australia, you go to Japan. So tell me where there is no earth architecture everywhere. There is earth architecture. All architecture has, all civilizations have used China. Look at China. So there are examples of building with earth and natural materials in the historic continuum or civilizational continuum, and it is part of the heritage of the world, the whole world, and it has to be, and we have to be sensitive to it, and we have to look at the commonality of and the threads that are common between all these various cultures and seek them.
To this, I would say that you see other countries, the kids, the children, the younger generation, they are so culture conscious. They visit museums, they visit art galleries. They have resources in front of them. However, we don't value this, in our education system. We don't have, it's all coming in now, the importance of art, culture, ecology, it's all coming in now. Don't you think we should be learning this at a very tender age, and it should be an integral part of us?
Of course it should. Definitely should. I know I had these huge bunch of kids who came from the Japanese school in Delhi. They came and made mud bricks with me at home. It was a great experience. But no Indian school has done that. We are pro-development. Pro-development, and we think we are in a civilization that really has to develop, and we have to become better and just equal to anybody in the world. That is our aspiration. So if that is your aspiration, then it's difficult to include respect for tradition within this aspiration.
We have a question asking whether mud is a valid material for coastal areas.
You have to add to the mud. Mud with additions is viable.
How would it sustain, how the roofing would sustain and the mud material would sustain in heavy rains?
Where is the mud in the roof?
She's talking about the walls.
Wall, it can sustain any heavy rain. It depends. It depends on how you make your wall and how you make your roof and how you make your foundations and how you make your windows, how you protect your windows, how you protect your walls.
We'll have a separate class with you for that.
No, it'll take 5 years, separate 5 years with me for that.
Basic migration of labor is a very big problem and a human crisis, which is, as it is evident now. So, do you
Mm.
think we can follow some kind of a construction practice where we can mitigate this problem, the migration of labor?
Well, I mean, so you need labor. You need labor because it is not a question of migration of labor. The migration is very much part of the human process. The issue is that uh, all our spaces must integrate and make space for them. And the way we must sustain them, and we must sustain them creatively, and we must recognize their inputs. So when I did the Anangram project, it dealt with exactly that, where I worked with this community of 350 traditional performing artists and craftspeople and designed their habitat, and they were to build their own buildings. So now that is the way we work, and these are itinerant, which means that they move from place to place. And over the last 40 years or so, they have settled in Delhi. So it addressed these very issues head on, and where we have to involve their skills, the people's skills, in terms of making habitat, both for themselves and for the rich, rather than copying buildings, copying the designs of the West and of Singapore or Shanghai, it's, or of civilizations that are just expressing technology and not expressing labor.
I'm very happy to share with you the fact that many workers who worked in the tribal museum at Bhopal have become very big artists in themselves, and they have got their names are known nationally and internationally, and they're having their own exhibitions. So that is a big contribution, I think, which your design philosophy and uh, work culture has brought to this building as well as the culture.
Buildings do affect it. I'm glad I'm so happy that this is happening and this has happened, because through architecture, people think that architecture is a separate discipline, and architecture does not influence culture. It does. It influences culture and a way of life.
But don't you think that this museum should be, digitally more be there? Nobody knows about it, and we don't. People only who come to Bhopal or whom we tell word by mouth, they would know. But don't you think the presence should be more? I mean, it should be promoted. Museums as such should be promoted in our country.
Museum should be promoted everywhere. I mean, for instance, when I go anywhere, I only go to museums. When I travel, the museum is a part of everybody, should become a part of,
Yeah, but look at the budget that they leave for museums.
yes, nothing. And then they manipulate the museum, they spoil it, they don't respect it. So there's a lot that needs to be done. There's a lot that needs to be done. And the processes are so complicated and bureaucratic. And
It all comes down to policy making in the end.
yeah,
A museum is a good example to show the finest piece of art. I mean, that would be like your benchmark. We have another interesting project on the screen in case you wish to just run through
oh,
it.
this is a bamboo pavilion. This is a bamboo pavilion that I made at the Gnostic Center in Delhi, Vijwasan, Delhi. Now, this particular pavilion was designed to cover the air conditioning outdoor plant. But
Wow.
when it was made, the clients decided that it was too beautiful to just relegate it to being a cover for the museum. And so they decided to make it into a tea house. And they use it to have their evening tea when they have conferences. And this is when we first introduced digital architecture into our vocabulary. So where we have craft, we have labor intensive systems, and we have now included digital computation into our vocabulary. My son, who had joined the practice a few years ago, has brought this in because he is deeply interested in digital architecture. And so over the years, we have incorporated into our vocabulary, and of late, we have started, not of late, over the last 7-8 years or so, we have incorporated digital computation into our architecture. And this really directly engages digital computation with the craftsperson who is semi-literate, meaning that they can understand dimension, and that's it. Beyond that, they're not savvy. So if through actually digitalizing and dimensioning the whole building process, we can circumvent the middleman, or we can use the engineer as the transmitter of the technology that the drawing encodes to the semi-literate craftsperson in order to create these kind of geometries and buildings. Simply is what we have commenced here, and we have taken it further in our future projects. These are digital buildings. This is where these are cottages at the Gnostic Center also, where we have used bamboos. We've built about 5 cottages at the moment, and we have to build about 3 more. And all the cottages are made from mud and bamboo. So we could just go through these and see if there are any more questions after this.
Sure.
So these were the various iterations we did. And here we have woven the bamboo as if it is a basket at the scale of the building. So if you look at our trusses carefully, there are 6 of those trusses, and they are interlocking with the next set of trusses. And so we have about 20 different beams in the space, and the space can be a span of 100 feet by 100 feet. And we just have used bamboo as the load-bearing member. Next. So here, this is the first row of first articulating of the geometry of the roof, the first beam. Next. Yeah, so there is the drawing of the beam, and the engineer who is directing the fellows at the site to make this beam initially. So he gives the numbers that we have written. We've encoded all the beams. We've given them all names, and we've given each node a dimension. So that dimension is transmitted to the site. Next. So then, once they are done, then you can place these beams over the existing beam and weave a whole structure in place. Next. So that is what the end result of the whole weaving process. Next. Over which we have placed bamboo crete again, and over the bamboo crete, in this case, we've used jute. We've pasted jute over the bamboo crete and then put in 1.5 inches of plaster over that with a murga jali. And that we beat the murga jali so that it assumes the curve of the bamboo below. So we have a corrugated murga jali over the jute. Next. I'm trying to eliminate this cement now and try and make buildings with just jute and soil again. Now here you can see all the drawings that we did for the two different kinds of cottages, and all the beams, and all these are digitally computerized. Next. And the bottom is built with mud, and the foundations here are of fly ash bricks. Next. Yeah, and this has a green roof over it. So this is in an urban area, in the green belt of the urban area.
Lovely. There is this sense of calm everywhere, you know, all your projects. There's this sense of absolute calm.
Thank you for recognizing that.
We have a question from Anshul Dureha. How should building codes need to be defined? Usage of natural materials and organic planning ethos in their documents to drive change in India.
Yes, there are organizations like TERI who are doing it, who are at it. So let them do it. And if more architects want to use it, then the codes will be made. We have to demand that these codes be made. The architects have to demand it. And so then the bureaucrats will probably then realize that it is important. The codes don't come first. The demand comes first. The need comes first. And then the codes can be changed and manipulated.
And we have a question from architect Rishi Sahu. What, according to you, is your landmark project and why?
Oh no, I can't choose a landmark project. Every project is a landmark. That is for the others to do.
It's like, you know, choosing which baby is the best.
I'm not going to do that.
Yeah. So I think that's it. Manojji, if you want to ask something.
Yeah, ma'am. Thank you very much. We are really overwhelmed with the way the sensitivity with which you are addressing the issues of cultural ethos and people in general. And I'm very much sure that all the participants and viewers have benefited with your present. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
And it's been a total pleasure and it was a fabulous talk. And I leave with a sentence she said, and which has really touched me, is that architecture is a symbiosis of man and nature. And she has a wonderful quote: where we build houses, the way we build the houses, the way people actually live there, these aspects have stayed with me throughout the 40 years of my practice. I always work with the client rather than for the client. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you. Bye. Nice being with you.